Hello and welcome to the JRE Review. This podcast reviews the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. No affiliation at all. I'm like the news is to Joe Rogan's podcast being current events. I just talk about parts of the podcast for the week that I really enjoyed, and this week was no different. Some fantastic podcasts to talk about. Podcast 1206 on the Joe Rogan Experience was Mike Ward. Mike Ward's conversation was very interesting. He is a Canadian comedian that was sued for a joke that he made and has had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. So we get to hear all about that, and what a great review it was. So enjoy. So yeah, Mike Ward is a Canadian comedian and an unfortunate fellow in his own right because he's had a battle against some lady and some family for a joke he made about a disabled boy. And really the joke was fairly off the cuff. It wasn't super malicious. It was kind of silly. You'll have to look up really what the joke is, but the essence of it was that some young disabled boy was terminally ill in Canada and going on shows like just TV shows, American Idol, that sort of thing, and he was a good singer. And then he got a record deal and some other things, and Mike Ward made the joke years later that, wow, this kid's success is fantastic, but wasn't he supposed to be dead already? Yeah, it's a cold joke, it's a dark joke, but there are some dark comedians out there. He's certainly one of them. So, because they don't have the same kind of free speech that they have in America, in Canada, he got sent some, like, a lawsuit that was charging him $82,000. And he ended up paying, I think, $42,000 for it, and it's ongoing, but it's kind of crazy that he was put in that situation, especially being a comedian. They kind of need to have the freedom to do that. So he's friends with Joe. He's known Joe a while, and he came on to kind of speak his piece. He seemed like a really nice guy, well thought out, gentle, like not malicious, and their conversation really reflected that. So, they started off talking a little bit about racism. I mean, in a sense, this is not a racist issue. It's just, but, it's along those lines of freedom of speech. And, they say once people aren't that racist, they will keep going until they find the next level of racism, meaning that the more sensitive we get and the more speech we kind of make illegal, the more we just look for things that seem that way, and then freedom of speech doesn't exist, and racism, in its own sense, is redefined. Joe brings up a really funny point that he loves to make, that Harvard is racist against Asians, and nobody really makes a big point about that. Because they're a big liberal progressive school, but they are stopping Asians from going to that university because so many of them are getting in. Their test scores are so much better than a lot of other races. And then they talk about Jordan Peterson got in trouble for his stance against compelled pronouns, which is also something in Canada that they are really pushing for. And it's just kind of like a dialogue against these sorts of events from taking over. The Human Rights Tribunal were part of the judges that dealt with Mike Ward's case, and it turned out that like two of the judges had either molested kids or had pedophilia on their computers, and they were part of the ones that passed judgment down on Mike for making this joke, saying that he's an awful person. And that hypocrisy is the kind of thing that a lot of people are paying attention to, because it's, in so many ways it's bullshit. It just kind of is ridiculous that is happening. And in a similar way, they, being comedians, they start talking about joke stealers. And that it's happening in Canada, and it's happening in Canada in an interesting way because some people up there speak French, and they can do their sets in different languages. And this is also how they notice that there's a lot of French comics that are just straight up stealing skits, entire comedy skits from Americans, because they can just change the language on you. They talk briefly about Mencia and what Joe went through at the Comedy Store. Joe said that's kind of like beating a dead horse. He didn't really want to talk about that too much more because he's talked about it forever. But then the conversation moved over to how Opie and Anthony from that show was able to do his own podcast and did it in his basement with total freedom. And that's really what inspired Joe, and Anthony will be on later in the week and we'll be talking about that. But it's a huge deal because it showed Joe the freedom that was available, that he could be exactly who he wanted to be, represent himself without any pressures, but also turn it into a great show, which is what we're starting to see. And it's awesome to hear how these different people have influenced each other. In a lot of ways, Joe talks about you must be careful who you align with, right? Because by doing that, it's not being selective, but you just got to find the people in your life that are going to be bad, and they're going to cause you to do negative things and cause some real problems for yourself. And he likes to repeat this because I don't think it can be said enough. And there's really, Joe explains that there's two ways to live your life. You either be yourself in life or pretend to be someone else. And, in some ways in LA, there's a lot of actors and they're acting. So they pretend to be someone else, even to the point of getting roles, because there's a narrative that you've got to be very liberal and progressive and say these things. And so you're that way. Or you can choose to be yourself, which may be honest, but you've got to deal with the brunt of the opinions that people will make. And it's very difficult. They talk a little bit about enemies, and enemies, in general, are a lot of work. It's just like if you find yourself having a lot of enemies, you might have to look into your own life and decide what decisions you're making. Save your energy for the real threats. Really pick your battles, Joe said, very carefully, and look hard enough, and you'll probably never even find an enemy. Meaning that if you only create enemies with people that are an actual threat to you, maybe just a physical threat or another type of threat, business threat, but a real one, if you only choose enemies that way, you probably won't have many enemies, because not all that many people are really going to be out to get you in that way. A lot of it is just a reflection of kind of how you're thinking. And then they end up talking a lot about different types of comedy. And there is great comedy these days, even though the dialogue is getting stifled. Freedom of speech is changing in its own way, but there's comics out there that are being bold, and they're really pushing the limits. And you've got guys like Richard Jenny from the past that had a super funny special called A Big Steaming Pile of Me, and that guy was fantastic. He was really big when Joe was up and started going, and also when Mike was starting out. If you haven't heard that comedy special and you're into comedy, definitely download it, check it out. It's really good. But either way, this conversation is not just great for those that are into stand-up comedy and want to know what the life is like, but also people that believe intensely in freedom of speech and appreciating what you have here in America, because not every country has it the same way. So anyway, thanks a lot, guys, for tuning in. I really appreciate you guys. Keep downloading, and there'll be more soon. Love you guys. Peace.